Primavera is about celebrating young Australian artists. It's showcasing, amazing new creative talent, and it's sort of a group exhibition that is nationwide. Really wants to sort of help support and give a new platform for younger artists who haven't really had that opportunity to show at that level.
And so how do you, as a curator, go about selecting artists to include work in a show like this?
Primavera has actually a really great open-ended premise. So every year they ask a different curator to curate it, which means we all bring a different perspective and a different sort of lens, I suppose. This year I decided not to give it a theme, and there's a fantastic opportunity where you get to travel around the country and sort of through networks and conversations and studio visits, you just get to look at lots and lots and lots of work and meet with lots of wonderful young artists, and slowly you start to formulate an idea around what will work together well, what seems to really give an insight into sort of fascinating and innovative practice. And so I was really looking at artists who had incredible crafting and technical skills, strong production values, but really I wanted to show how broad the definition of contemporary art can be and where those different elements sit in a contemporary society.
There's not a theme specifically for the exhibition, but is there something that unites the works that are seen together here?
Definitely. I mean, it is an exhibition. You need something to link the works, make sense of presentation for audiences, because that's who we're thinking about as much as we're loving giving the artists an opportunity to show on this sort of national scale. And so when I was looking at the work, I was really aware of how much sort of labour, how much sort of technique, how much skill is actually involved in making art. I actually work in an art school, and I think in some regards, having left the museum field to work in an art school, I was really struck by that level of production and commitment and labour and effect that goes into making work. And so while I wanted to show how sort of experimental artists are, that they do link to traditions of making, and in fact in many ways that sort of skill base, the making of things is something that we're losing as generally in society, and artists are some of the few people left with skills that can translate into the crafting of objects and things and experiences. The other thing that I was really struck by was how much young artists use the past as a kind of incredible source. So we think of art in terms of art history and that there's always a tradition, but rather than them looking to specific mentors or saying this one person is a strong reference for me, it just was this amazing pool in a way, a geography I suppose in which to travel in the past. History was something that seemed to be very much an awareness and a presence that they use in order to reinterpret their contemporary context.
So if the artists are looking to the past, as all artists do, for their inspiration, is there also quite a bit of innovation amongst the techniques and the craftsmanship that you're seeing?
Absolutely. That's what I was hoping to sort of unearth for people, is that while there is a kind of an interest, fascination and a kind of connection to the past, that we live in a moment in time, and no matter what we look to in the past, we are infused with our reality of the moment and the contemporary context in which we live. And so what we're seeing in this show is what are your subject matters, they change or they morph and meld, incorporating subjects that you wouldn't necessarily think sit well in concert with each other, but in fact do. Or while you might be using painting, that's an incredible sort of process that has a really ancient history behind it, but the developments that you're using in terms of perspective, subject, and then we're looking at things in here that PowerPoint is used as an art form, biro and plywood, stop motion animation, funny old kind of hobby craft materials like Fimo, and automotive paints. So, and performance, that way of engaging and interacting with audiences in the gallery context. So moving things away from static objects into experiences. So I really do hope that the show really relates that idea that artists have this wonderful ability, always incorporating new materials and tools in order to create compelling moments for engagement.
I noticed that you've worked internationally in New York before you were working here. Is there a big difference in the way artists are approaching their work in various locations, or does the work of our contemporary young Australian artists sit well in that international context?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think to a large extent what we've seen in the last 20 years in terms of globalisation across all elements of our experience, art has become a very international reality and a very global experience. And so I think 100 years ago or so, art seemed to really generate a sense of national identity, and Australia in particular was very interested in those ideas. Nowadays, I think what we're looking at is a great intermingling, a great level of exchange, certainly not just the ease of travel, but the forms of communication that we have allow for these sorts of integrations. But people's experience, their actual lived context, their immediate surroundings and immediate experiences will always form a subject and the things that people are translating into visual language. And so no matter how much geography is sort of folded into itself, there are ways that Australian artists can sort of have a different language than Korean artists and United artists in the United States. But artists are travelling, and they've always had that sense that place is important, but exposure and interaction is also incredibly generative.
For somebody who maybe hasn't heard of Primavera before, what can they sort of expect to see when they come to the gallery?
Well, I hope it's a great sense of energy, a sort of an insight into the contemporary context, and there is a level of playfulness in this show. I mean, and I really hope that there's a sense or a lack of that kind of ironic and satirical and cynical attitude that I think has been unfairly applied to aspects of contemporary art, but certainly in a way infuses a sense of the younger generation. And in fact, there's a great sense of honesty and vulnerability and integrity, I think, in this exhibition. But there's a play with materials and a sense of making and a joy in communicating that I hope that people would pick up on and come away with.
So many people seem to have a sense of contemporary art as not being accessible, or they kind of don't get it. And I'm wondering how, whether you feel that the work here is accessible even to an audience that's not really art literate, and how people who are maybe don't engage with contemporary art necessarily, what they might sort of take away from the exhibition.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I was thinking about when I was working on the research and thinking about which artists to select was that there is such a desire to communicate and connect and use visual kind of means to do that. And I hope a lot of the work in this exhibition it's very layered. There's a complexity around why it's being made, but there's a kind of there's a lot of graphic work in this show. There's definitely a kind of an overt sense of making that people can really relate to. We often laugh about the kind of Bunnings effect. It's not about just going to the hardware store and buying a bunch of stuff, chucking it in a corner and calling it art. Like, I was really trying to kind of shed a light on the fact that there is, there's a relationship to processes that we'd be familiar with, and yet there's wonderful levels of translation and innovation around that. And I do think that we were working with the idea that there's an aspect of play in this show, and the things that are familiar. So, while we are, Fimo and things that we might have all played with as children, PowerPoint, it's sort of ubiquitous and terribly boring, and yet you can reinterpret it and into a different dynamic. And, the films of James Newitt, which have these beautiful lyrical and kind of sense of integrity about working with community, and representing communities. So I suppose I would hope that there is a sense of connection that the artists are trying to make with audiences.